Bona tarda, good evening. En nom del govern d'Andorra i de la Barcelona School of Economics, us vull donar la benvinguda a la conferència que aquest vespre pronunciarà Ben Golub dins els actes de celebració del Premi Internacional Calvó-Armengol. Una especial benvinguda a la família d'Antoni, que ens acompanya avui, la seva esposa Goretti, el seu fill Tomàs, i crec que està per arribar el fill Jan, que segur que, a més, és el que està continuant una mica la tradició familiar. Benvinguts a tots, i també al teu company. Estem molt contents que estigueu aquí. El que volia fer també és agrair al Cercle d'Economia que ens hagi acollit en aquesta celebració d'aquest acte, que per nosaltres té un significat molt especial com a comunitat Barcelona School of Economics. Com sabeu, molts de vosaltres sou una persona molt lligada al Cercle d'Economia i, per tant, per mi és una satisfacció especial el poder fer aquest acte amb aquestes dues institucions a les quals tinc un gran lligam. Passaré a l'anglès, si no us importa, per deferència cap al nostre convidat, so I'm going to switch to English a little bit. Okay, so the Calvo-Armengol International Prize was established to honor the memory of Antoni Calvó-Armengol, which was one of the most promising academics of our community, the Barcelona School of Economics affiliated professor, and also he was ICREA, Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, professor. He was one of the best researchers of our community and a very promising researcher from Andorra. So he was very well known in Andorra, not only for his academic accomplishments, but also because he was very linked to his country, and he was actually doing a lot of representation and work for them. He unexpectedly and unfortunately passed away in 2007 at the age of 37. The prize, when it was established, aimed to reflect how was Tony when he left us. He was a young scientist full of energy, creative, academically rigorous, internationally recognized, and at the same time socially committed. That is the profile of the awardees of the prize, that the jury, along the years, has guaranteed doing an excellent job. In this way, the prize has got strong along the years, visible, with a large prestige, and has gained a lot of recognition. It is actually an aspiration of young researchers in economics right now to be awarded the Calvo-Armengol Prize. And actually, the other day, Ben was saying to us and confirming that really this is a very well-known prize and with large aspirations for young economists. I want to thank this year's jury, represented by Salvador Barberà, Marianne Bertran, Antonio Cabrales, and Joel Sobel, acting as president. Salvador Barberà is here today, and he will actually present the profile of Professor Golub. I also would like to give my gratitude to the government of Andorra and to his representative today, Javier Campuzano, who is Director of Sistemes Educatius, Ensenyament Superior i Relacions Internacionals. The governor of Andorra has been sharing with the Barcelona School of Economics the initiative at the very beginning and the values and objectives of the prize. Together, we have been able to build along these years a very strong and prestigious prize that is really internationally recognized. Let me just remind you of the awardees of the previous edition. So we had on the first edition Esther Duflo. Then we have Professor Roland Fryer, Professor Rak Shetty, Professor Matthew Gentko, and in the previous edition, Professor Millie Sadel. So we are now very honored to have Ben Golub, and I would like to warmly congratulate you, Ben, for this award today. And I think I'm going to pass the word to Salvador. I'm not going to actually present the profile of Ben because I don't want to repeat myself. So, Salvador, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, moltes gràcies, Teresa. Abans que res, voldria saludar la família d'Antoni, agraint-vos que ens permeteu honrar la seva memòria amb aquests premis. Com més passa el temps, més creix la seva figura com un intel·lectual i refermar aquest fet ens causa un gran plaer. These award ceremonies are always a way to honor Antoni Calvó's memory, to sense again the attraction of his magnetic personality, and to rediscover how deep a trace he left on the advancement of economics as a social science. But each ceremony is also different because it introduces us to the awardee's special way to contribute to such advancement and to understand how his or her work follows Tony's traces. Today, Ben Golub makes this ceremony special in this edition of the prize because it recognizes work on the social role of networks, a topic on which Tony really pioneered. For a long time, economics had focused almost exclusively on the analysis of markets where anonymous interactions prevail. In the last quarter of the past century, sociologists like Granovetter already highlighted the role of networks among individuals as a crucial explanatory force of different social phenomena. And distinguished economists like Akerlof were also fully aware of their importance. But this did not translate into an active modeling or analytical effort by the profession at large. It was only at the turn of our century that the first wave of papers, mostly theoretical, started to embed networks in economic models as an integral part of them. And Tony was there at the very start. The sparkle that he and other pioneers lit has generated an explosive process. It soon became clear that combining interactively the role of social networks with that of markets provides new insights on the functioning of the economy. All kinds of networks, networks based on the direct and indirect connection between individuals or in the relationship between firms, networks that enhance the possibility of social progress and others that may threaten society, like those that help the extension of disease or financial crisis or criminal activities. Indeed, introducing networks as an integral part of understanding economics turned our discipline into a much more social science than it had been. And Ben Golub has lived the spectacular growth of the field from the inside, contributing to it from different angles, working in the places where it developed. An undergraduate at Caltech, a doctoral student at Stanford, a young teacher and researcher at Harvard. He's now at Northwestern, associated both with the economics and the computer science departments. He has grown where the field was growing, from starting theory based on fixed networks to a much more dynamic view of the revolution, from theory to experiments, from formal analysis to more and more precise policy recommendations. And he has already shared responsibility for this growth in very significant forms. Just as an example of his early contributions, let me mention his key work on the biases induced in the workings and the consequences of networks that are due to homophily, our human tendency to form links with people that are similar to ourselves. We are eager to hear you, and I'll stop after a final reminiscence of Tony. We economists have often been a bit too patronizing about other social sciences, and I have been no exception. But Tony was an exception. He read extensively about sociology and other approaches to social phenomena. That surprised me at that time when we talked about it. Definitely, this differential attitude was one more sign of his broad look at the world and his intellectual ambitions. But I suspect that it is also had to do with the fact that he was the first Andorran to graduate from the École Polytechnique, and then French culture has always been more universal than ours is. We still have much catching up to do. We need people of his stature, and we sorely miss his inspiration. So congratulations, Ben. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So you started.
Thank you so much, Teresa and Salvador, for those introductions, which are much kinder than I deserve. It's an immense honor to be here. Distinguished officials, esteemed professors, honored guests. I just want to start by saying what an immense privilege it is to receive the Calvo International Prize. I'm grateful to the government of Andorra, to the Barcelona School of Economics, and the committee in charge of the prize, the jury. And I want to especially thank the many, many people at these institutions who've worked, done an incredible amount of work over the last 2 years to make this in-person celebration possible, even in these difficult times. I'm so grateful to be here and not on Zoom. And thank you so much for coming. Okay, so it's very special to me to get a prize in honor of Tony because his work has really been central in my life as a scholar. And I'd like to say a little bit about that before moving on to sort of the main topic. So Tony, as Salvador just alluded to, his breadth really was key to bringing network centrality analysis and network theory more broadly into the core of economic theory. He was really one of the key people in doing that. And a paper that is very strongly associated with that moment is this paper with Coralio Ballester and Yves Zanou about the key player. So I think many of you know this, so I'll just mention it very briefly. But they were interested in crime was actually their motivating application, and so they were interested in how you would think about the collaboration network in deciding which criminal you wanted to catch. So here, criminals are different sizes because maybe they're differently skilled or productive at crime, but they wanted to think about the network of strategic complementarities between these criminals. And the big insight was that if you think about maybe a certain criminal getting more skilled, something happening to make the criminal better, of course, the returns to crime for that person will make them work harder. But this will have indirect, if they're playing a game of strategic complements, then other criminals will work harder because of that. So here I've depicted this second stage effect on the friends of our central criminal. So he worked harder because his incentives improved. Other people work harder because of him, because his effort is increased. And then that keeps on going, right? So at the next step, you have the next stage of this reverberation. And interestingly, it reflects back to him, actually, because his friends work. So he has 3 little arrows next to him now, which are the sort of echoes, because his friends are working. His 3 friends are working harder. So now he has more reason to work. And so the insight that BCZ had is that these direct and indirect effects of an impulse correspond to a measure of network position that had a name and a long history in sociology, Katz-Bonasich centrality. And that was even though it's people when they read this paper nowadays are often kind of shocked because it's so simple, it's so clear what they did, but this first connection between a measure that was considered deep and important in sociology and elsewhere, and this simple game really opened a lot of ideas in economics. And it was sufficiently inspiring to me that in one way or another, I think that work and the vision that Tony had shaped my own work over in the last 10 years. And by the way, this insight was at some level latent in economics since Leontiev. So it wasn't, you can find traces of it before, but they really said it in a way that made a difference. And so to me, I've worked on, since then, I wrote a paper with Matt Elliott, when there's not a game, this is not about a strategic interaction, but just a situation where there are externalities, where there are pure externalities, say one country can help other countries by reducing pollution. And we thought about how the same kinds of network ideas, tracking cycles and centralities, could help us understand the potential for getting cooperative or market solutions to problems of pure externalities. With Andrea Galliotti and Sanjeev Goyal, I've worked on kind of generalizing this key player analysis. They were interested in who is the key criminal, who is the main guy. And we tried to think about, in a broader class of interventions, what is the right intervention? Maybe you don't want to just target one guy. Maybe you want to increase some people's incentives and even decrease others. That can happen in games of strategic substitutes. So we found that there's a certain kind of basis of network statistics that generalizes, kind of extends the one statistic that they focused on, and but their work was kind of the core inspiration for what we did. And then currently, as we speak, I'm working on, this paper doesn't exist yet, and the title is kind of a working title, but adding to this team Eduard Talamas, proud son of Catalonia, and Omer Tammuz, we are studying kind of I/O questions, pass-through and supply chains in complex markets using network theory. And basically, we're using the second-generation network theory, following up on this work that I've described, to understand how you might want to tax and subsidize in supply chains to overcome some of the problems of market power. So I just wanted, so Tony's work has really been inspiring to me at a, you can see that for 10 years I've been walking around his ideas and looking at them from different perspectives. But something, Antonio Cabrales told me something interesting yesterday in the car and the ride back from Andorra. He said that one reason he was especially sad Tony is gone is that he had a big impatience with picking over the same idea too much. And he had this desire to move ahead ambitiously to something new. So I think, I think he wouldn't mind that I'm going to talk about I could talk about basically his ideas for these 40 minutes, but I'm going to try to tell you about something new, which I'm excited about, which I think is a new frontier for network theory. But as we'll mention, it actually ties back into some of his work in the end. Okay? So here's what I'm going to talk about. It's this problem of, now starts the real talk. I'm going to talk about this problem that you see at least the newspapers writing about a lot, which is stuff disappearing from the shelves. The Amazon delivery time is way longer than you're used to. So newspapers, now it's like there's journalists whose business just is writing this article every week. The world ran out of everything, and we have supply chain disruption. So I don't want to uncritically take the journalistic story, but it seems real that there are cascading shortages that kind of make their way through the global economy. So there's a story that an article tells about a chemical company that is behind on 10 times more orders than usual because it's waiting for supplies. So they have one story about basically this company packages and resells a certain chemical, and this chemical is not being delivered by the wholesaler, so it can't, deliver it. And the reason that the supplier is defaulting is that it's missing one part that it's purchasing from a factory in China. Even something as simple as cans of paint, so metal cans that are shaped for a particular production process, if it's missing, you can't ship the goods. And so despite the fact that there's no shortage in the world right now in principle of metal to make cans, the loss of some inputs like that can really disrupt a lot of other businesses. And these are anecdotes. There's some data, so I haven't updated this in, this wouldn't make a good proper MBA lecture because these graphs are not from yesterday, but they're, as of this, we have lots of graphs from throughout this year that inventories are way lower than usual. Businesses are short on inventory. And that's happening especially in manufacturing and construction, businesses that put a lot of stuff together in sort of complicated ways. So this is a White House report on the pandemic supply chain disruptions. So this project is about trying to think about this from a network perspective. I don't claim to have any of the answers to the supply chain crisis, but I do think that it makes us think of some interesting network theory questions that are new. And so what we study in this paper is a process of, this is a paper with Matt Elliott and Matt Leduc, and we study complex production, which is a situation where you have many steps, and in each of these steps you combine several essential inputs. So I'll give you a silly example. Suppose you have everything you need to make an airplane, A, but you're missing two things that you haven't yet sourced, brakes and computers. These are chosen for alphabetical reasons. And brakes and computers don't grow on trees, they're also made in some other factory out of complex, as part of a complex production process. So a key point is that sourcing is specific, so important stuff is custom produced for this production process. You can't just go buy generic computers at Home Depot or the computer store. The airplane manufacturer relies on particular computers customized for it. And so this has major implications. So I'll show you a little picture. Here we have a little airplane manufacturer, and it has suppliers for its key inputs. It needs these inputs. And what you see in this picture is that firms have multiple potential suppliers of a given good because they don't want to be reliant on just one. These links sometimes don't work, so firms often have at least someone they can call up and say, hey, can you spin up your factory and give me this thing? And the key thing is this process kind of continues past one level. So the brake manufacturer is also relying on certain businesses serving it in a specific way. So you have this tree of supply relationships, and what makes it complex is that you might be putting multiple things. I'll call it complex if you're putting together multiple things at each step. And so what we study in this paper is a simple question, which is how robust is this network? If there is some exogenous randomness in, and I'll be more specific, if there's some exogenous shocks that this process is subject to, is the network going to work fairly robustly, or is it going to be very fragile? And what I'm going to shock is the probability that each of these sourcing links works. Okay, a very simple way to think about it is that, which is realistic, is that many of these relationships rely on shipping. And when shipping is stressed, then delays make it so that any given part might not arrive or might arrive late. And so when you stress this probability, when you reduce it, are you going to have a system that keeps working pretty well, or might you collapse kind of suddenly? That's the question. And we're going to then endogenize the investment in making these links work. Firms, of course, don't just take some shipping technology as given. They can pay more for better, suppliers. And we're going to ask whether endogenously we end up in an efficient or inefficient point. So this is sort of a criticism of the journalism, because when you read these articles, it says, oh, it's so bad that the goods are late. Well, maybe the planner, had some big social planner been organizing the whole world supply system, they would have been okay with some delays, right? You don't want to be robust to every shock. So there's a fundamental theoretical question of whether the formation of supply networks like this is efficient. And I'm going to claim that we don't have a full understanding of that. The main finding of the study is that there is a fragile regime, which I'll explain, where aggregate output is very sensitive to small shocks. Many supply chains are going to simultaneously freeze in response to a little shock. Like if you have suddenly the shipping system is stressed, you'll have many unrelated supply networks suddenly stop working. That's what the theory predicts. And moreover, it turns out that this situation is made worse rather than better by the fact that firms are optimizing endogenously. So that's the story I want to tell you. And even if I don't convince you of this whole story, I hope I'll convince you of a certain kind of model that might be interesting to study in connection with these things. So let me, and I hope, this is a fairly, I guess, academic talk, so I want to put it in context of other, a very active research area on related topics. So around 2010, macroeconomists, there was a renewal of interest in macroeconomics, in volatility in the macroeconomy because of networks. And one idea is that maybe sometimes a very central input, if it's shocked, can really mess up a big economy. So the thing is that the problems I'm talking about don't seem well explained by some common input that's being hurt. Maybe transportation, but quantitatively, that story has some problems if you try to actually calibrate these models. More recently, there's been a renewed explosion of research on these things, especially by Bakai and Fari, who did incredible work on production networks. And they're interested in nonlinearities and amplification of inefficiencies. But I want to make a simple point. These models are what I would call smooth. They're all like your macro models where you can nicely differentiate everything. They're not designed to think about things failing. They're not designed to think about these aggregate, discrete, on-off kind of problems. And so qualitatively, I think that the disruptions I'll talk about are just very different from the things that these models are built to study. So what we're going to do is we're going to develop a new network theoretic mechanism that may have a role to play in explaining this mess. We're going to consider a standard model of a supply network, but we're going to let links not work. Okay? Now, percolation models where links randomly work or don't are very familiar in networks. For example, in information spreading, people think about models where maybe I tell you a secret and maybe I don't, and that's random, right? There's substantial empirical evidence, actually, that firms are severely affected by individual links they have working. So there's a beautiful paper by Baron Savagnat, but also others that show that firms really get hurt when their suppliers let them down. It's not like there's a market where they can just go and, get back up. And so we think that links breaking is relevant for these kind of macro or real production issues too. But there's no theory on what happens when you randomly fail some links in a big production network like ours. The closest is actually some applied math work which inspired us in very different network settings, and we're going to build on some of their technical ideas to build this model of a production network with failures. So what is this model? Now in some sense, this is the key, this is the essence of everything. We have a bunch of small firms in the economy. I'm saying small, it's not like there's like a huge firm that if it fails, everybody's in trouble. Everybody is small and not so important individually. And each firm is sourcing its stuff, as we said before, from other firms that are producing in a similar way, right? So the idea is that this little airplane manufacturer has a few sources of brakes, a few sources of computers, and its suppliers are in the same situation basically, but they're one step less deep, right? Because they're closer to the source of closer to the raw materials. And then the most upstream firms, you can think of them as just having the materials raw, or maybe they can buy them with no problem, so there's no disruption risk for them. No, got a little stuck. Okay. So what I want to ask a very simple question. Oh, I see. There was an animation that I missed. Okay, so let me tell you a story about, so what's going to happen? These links were all potential links, but in actuality, some of them work and some of them don't. So some of these shipments are late. If this firm tried to ship stuff to this firm, that ship wouldn't arrive on time. And so we randomly delete some of the links. We make some of them work and some of them not work. And the probability that any given link works is X. And now we can ask a simple question: can our airplane producer make the airplane? Well, if you look at these inputs, so unfortunately this input here is not going to be successfully manufactured because this guy is just missing any of the links he can use for a key input of his. So that guy's dead. And unfortunately, the link, this one was working, but the link to him didn't work. That shipping link was badly shocked and didn't make it. And so as a result, our airplane manufacturer actually can't source any brakes. This link is working, but there's nothing to send. And so in this realization, A1 doesn't work. And what we want to ask is more generally, if I have a firm, this was one realization, I could have drawn these random links differently. And a simple question you can ask is, what's the probability that that node works? We're going to call it reliability. And reliability is a good thing, okay? I'm probably already being too technical for this talk. In the background, we build a standard model with love of variety where consumers are happy if more firms are working, but I'm just going to assume it's a good thing. And we want reliability to be greater. Now, reliability, I did it in this example for depth 2. Actually, reliability depends on depth, right? If you have a deeper supply network, it's harder for it to work. So we're going to look at a supply network consisting of many, many trees like this, of different depths, a whole distribution of depths. And we're interested in how reliability is going to respond to shocks, especially small shocks. Okay? So I'll just briefly say, I've said this already, but one more look at the newspaper. I think, especially now, it's coming to be widely believed that the shock is, at least in part, a shipping shock. That what happened was a big demand shock that people are buying more physical stuff. The ports have long queues of ships waiting. And so even supply networks that weren't hit by a demand shock, where there's no shortage in principle, now have to wait a long time, right? So this reduces the kind of hurts the technology of getting the stuff you need for many different kinds of shipping relationships. And just quantitatively, the prices of container shipping have really jumped dramatically. Now, of course, this is for the marginal container, so most firms aren't paying exactly this price, and shipping isn't that huge a part of the cost of things you buy anyway. So the fact that the shock looks big in this graph doesn't mean that it's some enormous shock to the cost of producing stuff, but it's a correlated global shock that certainly affects things somewhat, right? And so these pictures are, it's being documented in a bunch of different ways that this is happening. So now this is the most technical. Sorry for the small type. That's you can ignore everything that's a small type. But since there's so many people here who I'd like to be precise with, I'll just tell you very briefly the bigger model. So what we do is we just take that individual tree and we embed it in some kind of big economy, right? So we have a finite number of product types, A, B, C. In each of them, there's a continuum of small firms that make that thing. Every product type has a list of essential inputs that it really needs. And it has a depth, which in this example is 2, right? Here this is depth 2, these guys are depth 1. And I'm going to illustrate everything I say in this super simple example, but I actually claim that none of the symmetries I'm using are key here, so you have to trust me on that. But we're building the supersymmetric network where each firm needs a certain number of distinct inputs, here it's 2, and it has a certain number, here it's also 2, of potential places to get it, potential suppliers, which it grabs out of the continuum of people who can make it. And if you're depth 0, you have no specific sourcing, so you're going to always be effective. So we make each of these links, we have all of these links that are potential links. I've already done this, but let me just illustrate it one more time. And they're going to work randomly or not with a probability called x. Okay? And this is the main story, the main finding I want to tell you, really. What you can look at is a graph as you vary x, the probability that each of these links works. And on the y-axis, so on the x-axis we're varying this relationship strength. And on the y-axis we're plotting the probability that a randomly selected firm can produce. Now, it's important, an important thing is that I'm actually interested in the case where supply chains get reasonably deep. So for simplicity, let's take a 1-parameter family. So let's say depth is drawn Poisson with some mean, and for reasonable numbers, like a typical depth of 7 or 10 or 12, the picture starts looking like this. So what's remarkable about this picture is that relationship strength, there's a very sharp transition, right? If relationship strength is below something, then you have very low reliability, and then it gets very high. And as I make this depth parameter bigger, not crazy big, but you get an actual discontinuity. So below here, this thing doesn't function basically at all. At some x crit, the reliability jumps and reaches a big number. This is 0.8, I think, in this example. So it suddenly goes from 0 to 0.8 discontinuously. And that's the precipice proposition. For the nerds, I'll put a math version, but they're positive numbers satisfying the properties I just said. Until the critical x, you can do nothing, and then just above it, you can do a whole lot. Okay? And the contrast that I want to draw to make this more vivid is you can contrast this with what we can call simple production. So simple means that at every stage of this assembly, you only need to add one thing. Okay? So imagine a production line where it's a long assembly line, and you need to source an input, but only one. So first you make the base of the car, then you add one wheel at a time, and these sourcing links can still be disrupted, so you'll still multi-source. But simple means one at a time. That's very much like Kramer's O-ring model, if you remember that one. So with simple production, you get a very different story as you vary x. You still get a kind of interesting looking picture, but you don't get this discontinuity. The marginal effect of changing x a little bit is always bounded. There's never a place where a little change in x makes a huge difference to production if the change is small enough. So complexity, the fact that you need to assemble multiple inputs per step, is really a driving force in this story. Okay? So far this is not economics, I would say, because there's only a mechanical process of assembling things, and no choices have really been made. You can make it about production, but this is a network mechanics result. I do want to say for the I guess I have the benefit of giving an economic seminar without complaints directed at me, but all this, there's many symmetries here, and you might ask, is this about the fact that there's two at every stage? This picture would basically work in a much richer model where you had much more diversity in all of these parameters, very kind of general. It's not about the symmetry. But still, I think the question that we should ask is, who cares that there's a cliff here if you're not near the cliff? It could well be that, we're somewhere up here, that the real economy spends all its time around here, and so little shocks in X never actually make a big difference, right? So where the economics starts is, and this is, I won't spend too long on this, but I'll tell you now the part I'm more excited about, which is what happens when we endogenize the investment in supply networks. So now we let each firm actually choose the strength of its links. Invest in relational contracts, which is what makes your suppliers likelier to make good on their promises to you. So formally, each firm is going to choose a relationship strength investment, which I call XIF, before anything is realized. So firms make this costly investment. Its links, the links that it needs to work, are going to work with that probability. So I can even make my links work for sure if I want, okay? But I'm going to pay a cost, which, depending on how much relationship strength I want, I'm going to pay a cost with a standard increasing convex cost function. So now these strengths, which were a parameter before, are actually being chosen by the firms. And to close the model, and this is fairly reduced form, but just I'll ask for your indulgence, and believe me that you can get this out of a totally standard micro foundation. When firms produce, they're going to earn a gross profit. So they paid up front for the X. They might or might not be able to produce. If they can produce, they make a gross profit, which depends on kind of a productivity parameter here, kappa, and then a gross profit function which I've put one property into, which is that you're happier, conditional on being able to produce. It's better for you to produce when fewer other people can, because you get a larger share of the market, whatever, okay? This comes out of a standard micro foundation. So in this sense, firms actually have a good incentive to be reliable, because if other firms are not doing well, then they can take more of the market by managing to produce. And so first question is, if somebody was choosing these relationship strengths efficiently, if a planner could coordinate all the investments, would we ever end up on this precipice, right? So here's a question. Would it ever happen in a planner's solution that we would end up on the cliff? And the answer is definitely not. Definitely not. Because if you were there, then the planner asking everybody to invest just 1% more would have these huge marginal gains. The slope of the reliability curve is infinite there, so the consumer could eat a lot more, and the cost would be by definition tiny. So this is not an efficient outcome just by virtue of the infinite slope. But I'm going to argue to you that it is possible so there's two strikes against this point now. It's inefficient, it's definitely very bad, you would want to be above it, and it seems kind of non-generic. Why would you ever end up right there? But I'm going to give you a force that endogenously the network can end up on this precipice when people are investing in relationships. And that's going to be the last substantial result I'll tell you. So here's so this is the curve you've been seeing the whole talk. And what we're going to think about is this. I'll tell you, I'm telling you loosely, but it's pretty close to the way the proof really works. Imagine that your suppliers are producing with a given probability, which we'll call R. So somewhere over here, right? Maybe my suppliers are very reliable. And so I get to choose now. So other firms are making some investment choices which results in a reliability of R on average. And I'm facing them as my suppliers and my competitors. And I'm thinking, how much should I invest? Well, for example, if other firms are investing not at all, then they're never going to work and the returns to you investing are too low. So you won't, your best response level of strength might be quite low. In fact, it might just be 0 for a while here. And also when other people are very reliable, you probably don't want to invest like crazy because any link you get is going to actually have goods. So not much reason to get stuff there. So this curve has in general a complicated shape, but one thing that is true about it is that as I shift kappa, this productivity parameter, as I make gross profit scale down for everyone, obviously everyone has worse incentives to invest. Okay, so what I can do is I can move this around and track it turns out that a very natural selection gets you the top intersection as the equilibrium you care about. So as I shift the kappa, I'm eventually going to get to a place where the equilibrium goes on the vertical part of the line, right? The intersection where the investment incentives coincide with the physical rules of the game we're going to have a whole range of kappa parameters where you're going to be right on that vertical part. And so this is really the key result of the paper, that now this is all true when networks are sufficiently deep, but when networks are sufficiently deep, there's an interval so that for all the kappa in that interval, for all the productivities in this intermediate range, the equilibrium that we focus on has reliability arbitrarily close to the precipice. And below that, you can't produce anything, no luck. And above that, you're okay. But there's going to, even though the precipice x was just one little x among this continuum, in equilibrium, there's going to actually be a whole big chunk of kappas that are going to get you there. Okay, so that's the precipice. That shows that the endogenous investment here has a way of drawing the economy to this failure point. So, and I guess to draw out the implication, this is a different result. What this implies is that there is a range where things are fragile. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, suppose we thought we were playing this game, but then actually our X that we get is a little lower than what we invested in because the COVID came, okay? Then we're going to produce a lot less than what maybe zero, right? If you're here and you shock X a little bit, you drop down to zero. Now, all the economists in the room are thinking this is a terrible result because, of course, people would think about these shocks. But even when we anticipate the shocks, if you have a sort of small to medium probability of a small shock anticipated, this result will still hold. People will still invest inefficiently and put themselves on the precipice, and the small shock will still hurt production a lot. Okay, so you can do. I'm gonna now move toward closing. Okay. You can do comparative statics and complexity. You can do a lot of natural things. I want to sort of answer the question. I want to say 2 or 3 words. I'll leave most of this for the questions, but I want to say a few words about stuff you may be thinking. How much time do you think I should take? Okay. We're on time? Okay. So what's the market? I mean, what's the market failure? I don't know. Maybe you think that the story I'm telling is silly because firms are better than this somehow. Firms will do better. So I think that investment in reliability is not contractable. I don't think you can sell X, because I think what X is having dinner with your supplier in China, making friends, being so that you can call them in the middle of the night and they'll pick up the phone. And I don't think firms can credibly commit to do that. Maybe they can build reputation to some extent, but I think there are real frictions. What is, in this model, of course, firms are rewarded when they produce. They make gross profits. But that's not enough, because the problem is that, especially when you're near the precipice, there are going to be a lot of firms that are simultaneously pivotal for a given supply chain working. There's going to be many firms that if they drop out, a whole big set of other products can't be made. And so you can't give them you can't give each of them the incremental contribution to surplus that they make. There's not some magic solution with prices that comes from selling the final goods. You need contracts that are much more complicated to overcome the inefficiencies I'm talking about. And this echoes an important issue that comes up in networks all the time. So when people studied the financial crisis, a criticism you would often get is people would say, well, I think firms should price the risk, right? There should be equilibrium credit ratings, and so when you get involved in a risky deal, there should be a price on the risk you're taking. And if those contracts are good enough, then the only financial crises we have are efficient ones that should happen, right? Now, I don't think that's particularly plausible in the context of the financial crisis. I don't think it's the case that risk was ideally priced even for fairly formal, precise financial contracts. And so I don't think there's any necessary fact that such risk would be correctly priced in the real economy either. the last point here is that if you have the good idea of subsidizing X, saying we'll pay firms a little bit to invest, then equilibrium forces can undo that and push you back toward the precipice. So I claim that these inefficiencies are sort of deep, and that they might have a role to play in explaining why supply chains are seeming especially fragile. There's many extensions which I'll put up here and not talk about, but what I do want to emphasize is something methodological in coming back to Tony. So one thing that I've been wanting to do since grad school is to make a model that has more, network models can be very intricate and complicated. And this model has very simple choices. You just choose a number. So all the network stuff is in the probabilities of things working, and you can write those functions down, but somehow the economics ends up being more like first-order conditions. It ends up being more like search, right? And I think that idea, of course, people like me get excited about the intricacies of the details of the network, but endogenizing probabilities and not links themselves has a big methodological advantage. It makes these models way easier to solve. And this is actually a Tony idea. So he has a paper which is not which is I think underappreciated relative to its value and some of his other papers with Cabrales and Zanu, where they actually introduced this kind of method of just choosing a number, how much to socialize. They thought how much should I go to bars or how many conferences should I go to, and they developed a model where that they could solve for social interactions and study the efficiency of that. And Tony was always very interested in social behavior, as Salvador said. But a lot of those ideas, actually, which were developed for these social questions, have applications to big grown-up economic questions like supply chains. And so I want to just and so this was sort of something that inspired me. And then recently, my student Krishna Dasratha built a beautiful model which is forthcoming in Restud, which uses similar methods to study innovation. So he thinks about firms deciding how much to be open and let their employees share ideas with others outside the firm. And so the trade-off is that they might hear good ideas, but unfortunately they might leak out some of your proprietary secrets. And he solves an equilibrium model using methods we were doing this simultaneously, and I owe a lot to him in the development of these methods. And he also finds that equilibrium networks are right on a boundary that seemed unlikely between sparse and dense. And so I think these methods of choosing a random graph probability are really exciting and high potential. And so, but so much for economics, okay? I want to close with something different. I want to say thank you. So I came to Barcelona first in 2010 for the first Calvo Prize workshop that was organized by Esther Duflo, who was the first winner. And that was an incredible experience for me because of seeing Barcelona for the first time and meeting the economics community here, but also because this workshop that she organized was just an incredible coming together of, she invited leading scholars in networks, and everybody, there was so much sadness, but also kind of energy coming from honoring Tony's memory, and these scholars came together, and for a young person, it was. I was telling someone before this talk that it was the best conference I've ever been to, but also the first. So I had no idea how good it was. And there was just this amazing energy from bringing together some of the best applied researchers and network theorists, and it led to a lot of ideas and the birth of a lot of collaborations that have persisted to this day. And here's me at 25. In the audience, very lucky to be there. This is Yves Zanu. This is Esther, actually. Matt Jackson. So I'm just so grateful to have been a part of this story and been included. And that makes me think of another community that I am grateful to. These are all the people that I've been lucky to work with over the years. And so I mean, Barcelona, since that time, I've come back almost every year except for COVID, because the intellectual community here is so incredible. And over the years, I've been presenting work here at the amazing workshops. And so I have such gratitude and respect for all the institutions that have been built here, and this prize, and just, Barcelona has been an incredible community. And I have many memories here of working with many of these people. As I said, many of these relationships, like Abhijit and Arun, I actually met here, and we started working together. So this has been an incredibly important part. This community has been an incredibly important part of my life, and these people have been really, the whole substance of my intellectual journey. So I just want to close by saying how grateful I am to have worked with my co-authors, and by dedicating this prize to them. Thank you so much.
I have two questions. One is on the asymmetry assumption that you say it's not necessary, but I kind of suspect that some degree of symmetry or not too much asymmetry has to be embedded there.
Great.
Because that's, I don't know, but it's probably you've thought more about that. That's number one. And number two, your firms are very small, right? So would larger firms internalize some of these potential problems? Because, I mean, here there are some big firms.
Yes.
I mean, around, no? Depends on the sector, etc. No? So what do you think?
Thank you very much.
Consideration?
Thank you so much for both questions. Let me start with the second question. I think absolutely big firms, this story is making this theoretical point that these externalities exist and are especially severe in this continuum economy. But I think firms like some of the Japanese, famous stories of really managing the supply chain and using, and they cared about that because of, I think, partly of their market power. I think this provides part of it's very consistent with the story we want to tell, that it's integrating vertically to some extent, or in any case, if you're big, investing is definitely can improve these problems. I do think that unless you're perfectly vertically integrated, investing in your suppliers is often kind of a public good, right? Because other people also benefit from you monitoring them, and so we would expect it to be underprovided, but it absolutely would be a force to improve things. On your other question, I totally, this is how you are giving a talk here that people tell you they don't believe you. So it's true. I don't expect you to believe me. I'll tell you, I can't, it would be selfish of me to take 5 minutes to talk about the proof. I'll tell you, if there are enough questions about that, I might. But for the moment, all I'll say is that what's really key is that enough firms have complex. So one asymmetry that would kill this is if many firms had simple technologies or very low depth, right? Because then you wouldn't have this problem. But if enough firms are complex, that's enough. So the key thing is really sufficient complexity rather than symmetry. Because once firms get complex, the basic idea is that what I need to prove is that it's not possible for there to be an equilibrium where we're all very low but positive reliability, right? If I can rule out those, then I have to drop down from high to zero. If I can rule out small productivity equilibria. And when my suppliers, when enough people are complex, the returns, you can't have a fixed point that's low, because when you and Teresa are both low X, and I need both of you to work, then the probability that both of you are working is very, very low, right? And so there's no chance really that if you look at their customers, then their probability of sourcing will be even lower. And so that's how you kill these sort of fixed, that's what, but I can talk more, but so I really claim that symmetry doesn't matter that much, but I probably will have to convince you offline.
Just a little question. You told us that you cannot sell the X. Can you go deeper on this assumption?
Yeah. I just meant that it's so. My claim is that what makes X, what a firm, the way a firm gets higher X is by doing a better job with the soft stuff. And so it's too extreme to say that you can't sell it because a firm can build a reputation for having great relational contracts. But there is always, I don't claim that it's impossible, but I think there's friction once you get into the realm of selling something that can't be monitored and can't be directly checked. You have to rely on reputations and soft things where there's frictions and you don't generally expect to get the fully efficient level. And so I think in industries where you can really monitor your suppliers' investments, things should be better. But in cases where they can divert things, they can take stuff that you were supposed to get and sell it for a higher price, unless, there will be times when they can do that and can get away with it. And unless you can, so the lack of that monitoring means that, it's hard to imagine how it gets, how these contracts are perfect. But that's what I meant to say by that.
Hi. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
So your co-author Matt, I think, presented this for the micro group maybe a month ago. I could be wrong. And one of the things I asked him, and I didn't elaborate too much, was about the structure of these networks, and that all of them are trees.
Yeah.
So all I asked him was to confirm that this was an assumption or not. I didn't ask further whether you had thought about relaxing this or if you had explored different structures for these networks. And if you have, I'd be curious how that's gone.
That's a great, so Chabier's question is relevant here too, because the fact that they're so small means that it's very unlikely. If you're building these every firm is small, then the chances that you hit the same one twice is small. But as they got bigger, that might happen, and that would make the analysis much harder. So the honest reason that we stick with trees is for tractability. We have done simulations where we allow some cycles, and they don't, if the firms are reasonably small still, it makes no difference. I don't know why cycles would be that important, because the story we're telling here is somehow, they just introduce annoying correlations, but I have to confess I don't know which way they would go. So, part of the game here is that these models, you set them up just right so that the equations ultimately are fairly simple, and once you start putting those correlations in, they get away from you again. So it's a tractability, that's the honest answer, but I don't have a reason yet beyond the other. I think other things that come from firms being large would probably be more important than creating cycles, is the reason we haven't.
Yeah, this is a bit about interpretation. So you show that we could be at the cliff, right? It's reasonable that we are at the cliff given certain parameters, but at the same time, the observations we have is that X went down and we had some problems, right? So given this picture, it could also just be that you're really on the right, right? So in a sense, I don't know, the result just shows that something very bad is possible, but more reasonable is that something a little bad is possible, right?
So I guess this is where I want to push back against the journalists a little bit, because they want to say that the shocks to shipping are so, they're so big, and it's not. I think that it's a quantitative question, which I'm not qualified to work on, but I think applied economists should. In terms of estimating the production function, how big a deal are these queue delays and so forth in the actual cost of the firm? This is telling a story that this is giving an amplification mechanism, right? Now, and so I agree with you. I think all this does is says there's a possibility for an amplification mechanism. And there's a force that endogenously makes the region where it happens a lot bigger than you might initially have expected, right? That you're somehow drawn to this region. But I agree with you that it doesn't. We're inspired by the crisis and thinking, oh, these chains are complex and this X matters. But in terms of saying, oh, we were necessarily on the precipice, what is true? I'll tell you one thing, okay? If you have a continuum, so if we go back to the main result, and if you have, a big economy with all sorts of different supply networks as part of it, then all of the parameters I said will be all over the. So I'll find. Sorry for the flipping. If you go back to the main result, what we claimed is there's sort of a positive measure of economies that are, so we'll do it like this, right? There can be all these economies with different M's, maybe different kappas, and I claim that the fragile configuration in this equilibrium notion is a positive probability event. So if you have supply networks like this all over the place, some of them will fall in the fragile regime in equilibrium, and when you shock, those guys will be in trouble. So I've told you this stark story about one of them, but if you integrate over a lot of them in a big economy, it gives you a reason to expect a big response to a small impulse. And that's a force, but as a theorist, I'll leave the quantification of it, to others.
What policy would restrict the fragile region?
That's an amazing question. I don't know, but it's a great question. The question is, what policy would make these fragile regions narrower so that there would be fewer economies that would be fragile? And that's a great question, which I'll think about, but not live.
I had a question about the knowledge that firms hold about the depth of the network that comes before them when endogenously choosing the X.
Yes, that's a great question. So I assumed in the basic model here, I didn't say it, so but I assumed that it's a symmetric equilibrium where you choose before you know even your depth, okay? But it turns out we don't need that. We figured out, basically, shallow firms can know they're shallow. What is important, we do need some incomplete information. If you're sufficiently deep, it's important that you don't know exactly how deep. And then we solve for a symmetric equilibrium among those firms. But that's a wonderful and important question. Were you our referee?
No, not at all.
Yes, so this is a very general question, but I think it's a good setting for general questions. So your work and other related work with either cliffs or multiplier effects, I think it's very close to reality, because maybe I'm biased, but I see it all around us. But on the other hand, it's very far away from empirical identification, because when you have such drastic changes, anything can go, and causality is very hard to pin down. No? So can you give any insight on how to do this?
I can pitch one of my favorite papers. There's you may have come across it. There's a famous paper by Card, Moss, and Rothstein, which was about identifying tipping in residential segregation. So if I could get into what's going on behind this cliff, it's fixed point pictures that are very similar to what you see in platform models or network good markets, where you care about how many other people are buying the good or whatever. Same math. And there you have this tipping too, right? There can be a critical mass below which the market collapses. And Card, Moss, and Rothstein took that to the question of racial segregation, segregation and tipping of neighborhoods when white flight, basically, right? And so they used census tract data to look for a kind of discontinuity in the rate at which white people flee minority neighborhoods. That's sort of and so I think that paper is taught with admiration by labor economists like David Otter as a way of taking this seemingly, I agree with you, this quite stark and non-empirical seeming type of theory to data. And I think there's a lot of cleverness in how they looked for discontinuities, also a lot of room for improvement. And so I think that paper is an inspiration for where to go from here, and I think that there's a lot of room for empirical work of that type. Is that good? Thank you so much for the questions.
Yes. So this is a closure. Just thank you, Ben, for your wonderful presentation. Actually, this just is an additional proof that the jury was completely right about choosing Ben for our 6th Calvó-Armengol Prize. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Thank you, the family, for being with us again another year. There will be another one sooner, because this year we are 1 year late, as Ben said. So we hope to have a ceremony in maybe less than a year with a new prize. Okay, so thank you very much.